So hello. Now, the project management life cycle is often viewed as 5 stages. Some others view it as 4. So I will use the 4-staged one because as you are running through the entire 4 stages, you keep monitoring and controlling, which is identified as an extra stage of the life cycle by some. Okay, so initially you start by initiating the project, and then once it's initiated, you move on to planning for it, executing your plan, and then you close out. So the key thing now is coming up with the idea. What ideation, what exactly are you thinking to do with respect to this project? What is that unique thing you want to bring about? So that will help you define the parameters. And at this point in time, you're thinking of outputs such as your project charter, which helps you understand, exactly what the project will be about, the scope, which tells you how much it will cover, the initial schedule or plan using something like the project Gantt chart, and then you estimate budget. So all of this will be in the initial parameters that have been defined. And then you begin to identify the risks and then the quality. How will you know that what you've set out to achieve has been achieved? So you have your charter, you have your forms with respect to your dissertation, you have the scope, you know that you can't go beyond, let's say, 20,000 words, for instance, and then you come up with your initial schedule, which you then, all of this you put together to give to your supervisor for approval. And of course, that's trying to sit it within 3 months or 6 months, as the case may be. And then if you have any budgets, you also come up with estimate for that with respect to spending, etc. So in addition to this, during the initiation stage, you try to identify risks. What could go wrong? Perhaps your supervisor may not be around when you're trying to do some bit of the work. So that on its own is a form of risk. Then you start trying to identify things like, how do I then mitigate this risk if it happens? And moving on from there, besides the risk, you also want to understand what the standards are. Okay, so what should chapter 1 look like? What should chapter 2 look like? Because these are the key deliverables for this particular dissertation project. So you have to then look at the assessment brief, look at what the quality criteria there is, the metrics, marking criteria. So that will then help you understand how to pitch your particular dissertation at the end of the day. And once you have this, you develop the initial project plan. So you have your communication plan, and then you also look at how often you can meet your supervisor, etc. So once that is done, you go to your supervisor, and if it's approved, you move on to the planning stage. So you refine those parameters. Okay, so you look at your project scope again if it's going to change, because oftentimes when you come up with a project idea, it can be so massive, and when you meet with your supervisor, they will tell you, no, this is too much. So you have to scope it down further. So once all of these have been, approved and you're happy with it, your supervisor is happy, then you review the baseline schedule and then come up with one. You review the schedule and then come up with your baseline schedule that you would then use to manage the project till the end. So you assess the risk and define, the QA and then the QC procedures, or quality assurance procedures. So once this is done, you refine your project plan again and you are set to go. So between the planning and execution, all you are then doing is everything you planned to do, you then just start doing it. So while you are doing it, you are monitoring and you are controlling and ensuring that you are doing the things you said you will do within the specific date and time. So that's what the monitoring and control is as you execute. So once you keep doing that, at a particular point in time, you'll find out that if you schedule, let's say, literature review for February, for instance, by the end of February, it should be done. And once that is done, that bit should be checked by your supervisor. If they're happy with it, you move on to the next one. Of course, let me mention here that literature review is that chapter you never finish until you finish the entire project. Because when you finish, you have to check again, is there anything new in this space? So you can include it into your literature review and then discuss it in your discussion chapter again. So once you keep going, so it's like an iteration, you move through every single thing you plan to do. And once you've done them, then If they are all accepted by your supervisor, then you are done. So you identify the lessons and archive these for further projects. So this, in a nutshell, is really what you do. So I've tried to apply these to your project, to your dissertation as a project. Okay, so now that's what I'll look at next, which is what I just explained. Managing your dissertation then as a project. So it's the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to meet this project requirement. Okay? Using your dissertation as that project, which is what I have actually explained using this diagram here. So looking at it in a closer format, since we said projects are a set of interdependent tasks that have a common goal, you find that if this is your dissertation project, you're going to have, one phase or two phases, or as the case may be, say 5 phases with different work packages or the things you are going to be working on. And for each of the work packages, you will then have activities that you need to complete. So if you complete this activity, then you will achieve this work package, which will then help you achieve this deliverable. Say, for instance, you have a work package called literature review, which is your chapter 2. So the activities, the relevant activities will then be things like go to the library, identify required textbooks, review the textbooks, write draft notes, and then add citations, check with supervisor. So things like that, once you complete them, you would have completed this work package. So a set of activities for different work packages, when completed, will help you arrive at, the different deliverables, which will then feed into the project itself. So no matter what project it is, they're all broken down into objectives, like I mentioned earlier, which you set. And these objectives will then have measurable deliverables as well. So looking at your dissertation again as an example, you have several sub-projects like your introduction chapter, literature review chapter, methodology chapter, etc. And for each of these, you have subtasks, having different work packages and activities that you then need to complete in order to arrive at your project itself. So when you then finish that, looking at a timeline is just going to look something like this. Say for a project that starts in January, for instance, and closes off in December, but you don't have the luxury of 1 year. Normally, it's going to be like 3 months for your dissertation, okay? So if you have a 1-year project, for instance, you start in January to come up with the topic and aim, you check and you have approval from your supervisor, and then you plan that by February you start your literature review, and then by March you go into the methodology chapter, and after that you move on to designing your data collection tools based on what methodology you've decided to adopt, again based on the philosophy for this particular research. And then once you've developed or designed your tools, you collect the data. So you run things like focus group sessions or administer surveys, etc. So this presumably is in May. And then by the time you get to the middle of between June and July, you start analyzing the data. Okay, so you give yourself like 6 weeks to collect the data. And then once you analyze, if it's qualitative data, then you're looking at using things like NVivo for qualitative thematic analysis. If it's quantitative, then you use things like SPSS. So now, once you've analyzed the data, you start looking at your findings. And then you discuss. So when you're discussing, you come back to your literature review. You compare these findings with what you have seen in the literature review. So that will introduce some gaps. And then you now begin to discuss, why am my findings similar to the findings of so-and-so 2018, for instance? Or why are my findings so different from the findings of Orim et al. 2021, even though we were looking at this aspect that is a bit similar? So you start discussing. So that will give rise to, possible recommendations, and then you conclude. And once you conclude, you pull the document together again, you review, and then you submit. So this is what the plan will then look like as a timeline. And then when you use the Gantt chart, Microsoft Project Gantt chart, you then build things out this way, depending on what you actually set out to do. So remember, this is what should be in a Gantt chart. So this will be the highest level, and then you have these sub bits, and then you have your subtasks and all the activities that you need to complete in order to achieve it. So when you then start monitoring and controlling, the key thing you're then trying to do will just be checking each of the activities and trying to see, okay, I was supposed to do this by June 2021. Is it done? Yes, it's done. 100%. You update that. And then as you go along, you keep updating. Okay, this is just 70% done. I have 30% left. So that when you look at this Gantt chart, you're able to know how much work do I have left? How much time do I have left? So that way you're able to keep everything in view and monitor and control. So if, for instance, you look at this, or this 0%, 20, so you can actually sum up what you have left to do. So looking at this now, you still have about half of the work to do. So if half of your time is gone, or let's say 60% of your time is already gone, then you know that you must fast track things. So you can then decide, to put more work into some activities that you can actually crash, as it's called in project management, just to ensure you're able to meet the deadline or the timeline. So in summary, during the initiation, you start the project, and the goal of this phase is to define the project at a very broad level. And then secondly, you move into the planning stage, which is where the key thing you are doing here is to focus on developing a roadmap that everyone will follow. You, your supervisor, the people you'll be interviewing, for instance, if you'll be using interviews, focus group sessions, etc. And then once you have this plan, the baseline plan in place, and it's been approved, you then move on to executing this plan. Okay, so you start having meetings with your supervisor, you meet with your participant to collect your data from, etc. And you start analyzing this to know, the kind of things you said you will do, So you review your literature, your sources to come up with your literature review. You look at them again to have an idea of how, what people have done with respect to methodology as well, and what your philosophy is. How do you want to do your own research? And then, of course, you start doing these things. You collect the data, you analyze it, you begin to look at the findings and compare it with your literature review sources. And that will then help you arrive at your recommendations and conclusions. So while you're doing all of this, you are checking, you're monitoring and controlling, like I said. And then once you have all the deliverables ready and approved by your supervisor, you close. So during the closure, you don't just get up and walk away. You start putting your documentations together. You start looking at the last chapter, which normally will be reviewing how you manage the project. What lessons have you learned? So you pull all of this together in order to have the final documentation. So thank you very much for watching this video. I've introduced some key terminologies like your dissertation, and then project management itself, as well as what a project is. And then I've tried to then explain how you can manage your dissertation as a project. I've concluded, and like I said earlier, if you have any questions at all, please pass them to me through your lecturer. Hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you.